In a quiet corner of the city, hidden away from the rush of the world, lived a young woman named Saraswati. She was the embodiment of simplicity, a delicate soul wrapped in the traditions of her family. Her days were spent in the confines of her home, where her father's stern eyes watched over her every move. Saraswati's life was a routine of silence and submission, her dreams buried beneath the weight of her family's expectations. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, her hands cold as she prepared the day's offerings. And each night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was more to life than the lonely path she walked. Across the street, in a cluttered studio filled with half-finished paintings and the smell of turpentine, lived a young man named Indare. He was a troubled artist, a soul haunted by the ghosts of his past, and his life was a canvas splattered with the pain he couldn't express in words. Indare was a man of few words, his heart guarded by walls of anger and regret. His art was his only escape, the one place where he could pour out his sorrows without fear of judgment. But despite the passion in his work, Indare felt a void inside, a hollow space that no amount of paint or brushstrokes could fill. Fate, it seemed, had plans for these two lost souls. Their worlds, so different yet so similar in their loneliness, were about to collide. One fateful afternoon, as Saraswati rushed out of her house, tears streaming down her face after yet another argument with her father about an arranged marriage, she found herself standing at the edge of the road, unaware of the car speeding toward her. Just as she was about to step forward, a strong hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back to safety. She looked up, her eyes meeting those of her savior, Indare. Time seemed to stand still as they stared at each other, two strangers connected by an unspoken understanding. From that moment on, something shifted in their lives. Saraswati couldn't forget the intensity in Indare's eyes, and Indare couldn't shake the image of Saraswati's tears from his mind. Without knowing why, he found himself watching her from his studio window, sketching her face over and over again, each stroke of his pencil capturing the sadness he saw in her eyes. And as for Saraswati, she began to find small drawings left at her doorstep, drawings that seemed to capture her innermost feelings, as if the artist knew her soul. The bond between them grew in the silence, a connection that needed no words. Saraswati would wait by her window each night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious artist who had saved her. And Indare, who had always kept to himself, found a new purpose in these secret exchanges. But in a world bound by tradition, their silent love was not without its challenges. Saraswati's father, a man of strict principles, had already chosen a suitor for her. He was determined to see his daughter married off to a respectable man, someone who could uphold the family's honor. When Saraswati gathered the courage to speak up, to tell her father that she didn't want this marriage, his anger knew no bounds. He forbade her from ever seeing Indare again, calling him a disgrace, a man unworthy of her. But how could Saraswati explain that it wasn't a choice? That her heart had already chosen Indare, long before she even knew it herself? Her father's harsh words echoed in her mind, but so did the memories of Indare's kind gestures, his silent support. Torn between duty and love, Saraswati felt as though she was being pulled apart. One night, when the weight of her father's demands became too much to bear, Saraswati snuck out of her house and ran to the one place she felt safe, the small garden where she and Indare had begun to meet in secret. The moonlight bathed the garden in a soft, ethereal glow as she sat on the bench, waiting. When Indare arrived, the pain in his eyes mirrored her own. They didn't need to speak to understand each other's torment. They held each other that night, not knowing what the future held, but certain that they couldn't go on without each other. But even as they whispered their dreams of a life together, they knew that reality would be much harsher. The pressures from their families, the societal expectations, they were too much for their love to bear. The next morning, Saraswati woke to find a letter at her door, a letter that made her heart stop. It was from Indare, written in the middle of the night, telling her that he couldn't let her destroy her life for him. He asked her to forget him, to go through with the marriage, to live the life her parents wanted for her. He told her it was the only way for her to be happy, even if it meant sacrificing their love. Saraswati's hands shook as she read the letter, tears blurring the words on the page. She felt as though her heart had been ripped from her chest. How could he ask her to do this? How could he ask her to live a life without him? But as the days passed and the pressure from her family grew, Saraswati realized that Indira had made the decision for her. She would go through with the marriage, even if it meant killing the part of her that still dreamed of a life with him. The day of the wedding arrived too soon, and Saraswati found herself dressed in a bridal sari, sitting in the midst of a celebration that felt like a funeral to her. The rituals were performed, the guests cheered, and yet all Saraswati could think of was Indira, where he was, what he was feeling, and whether he was hurting as much as she was. But the story was not to end with a wedding. As the final rites were being performed, Saraswati's world began to spin. Her breath grew shallow, her vision blurred, and before she could utter a word, she collapsed to the ground. The guests gasped in shock, her parents rushed to her side, but it was too late. Saraswati's heart, already broken by the weight of the choices she had been forced to make, could bear no more. Indira, who had stayed away from the wedding, knowing it would only deepen his pain, was devastated when he heard the news. He rushed to her house, but by then, it was too late. Saraswati was gone, leaving behind only the memories of their brief time together and the love that had blossomed too late. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by family and a few close friends. Indira watched from a distance as Saraswati's body was laid on the pyre, the flames slowly consuming the only woman he had ever loved. He wanted to scream, to cry out to the heavens, but all he could do was stand there, frozen in grief, as the smoke from the pyre rose into the sky. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but Indira could not move on. His art, once his refuge, became a prison. Every canvas he touched turned into a portrait of Saraswati, her face haunting him in every stroke of the brush. He became known as a great artist, but to him the fame was meaningless. All that mattered was the pain, the loss, the love that had been taken from him. Years passed, and Indira continued to paint, each piece a tribute to the love he had lost. His gallery became a shrine to Saraswati, a place where people came to admire the beauty of his work, unaware of the sorrow that lay beneath each painting. But for Indira, it was not enough. No amount of paint or fame could fill the void that Saraswati had left behind. And so, dear viewers, remember this tale not as a story of loss, but as a story of love, pure, unyielding, and eternal. For even in death, love endures, leaving behind echoes of what could have been.